me?
Yes, sir.
All right. So there are two more lectures left, tomorrow and day after tomorrow, and about the test. So it will be 90% MCQs, and then there'll be a reading assignment, which I'll send you guys. I'll upload a very basic, not very basic, like kind of a seminal historical paper, and you guys need to read that, and there will be a couple or two or three questions about that. Uh, I mean, the idea would be that, what are the major points and what do you understand of it? So, and the rest of the material would be on what have been taught. And also at the same time, I'll also send them major kind of points we discussed and from the textbook, basically just read, just kind of go through as I said, the major points.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
The reading material that you're going to send, from
Yes.
that we can expect a few questions during the test the exam that
Yes,
we're going
yes,
to have.
yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
And the rest of the questions would be multiple choice type questions.
Yeah.
Okay. And could you, since many very less people have joined till now, could you perhaps write a post on Teams regarding this so that everyone can see it?
Yes, yes, yes. So I'll upload a document with instructions on it, and the paper too I can upload it right away, right? So I'll do that today and the rest of the lectures, and that's it. Sounds good?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, we can do that definitely. Yeah, so we'll talk about the motor system today in short, and then since it's an undergrad class and we are basically covering the basic concept of neuroscience, so the idea was to keep it at that level, and so the reading material that I would send you, that kind of of course you need to gain some more on this technical understanding, but the idea would be kind of stay in the kind of what we have gone through, last few classes. So nothing very different. So that's kind of the point. Yeah. So the motor system is basically how we control our muscles and and how we voluntarily control our muscles. And one of the major goal of neuroscience is that we understand behavior and what is driving this behavior, how are these behaviors happening, and we want to learn from the level of what's going on in the whole brain to the level of neurons, the cells, to the molecules. But as I said, the major output of whatever we do, or like what we think, we can't, nobody can see that, but what is really perceived by the world around us is what we are doing with our arms and our body and the legs, and that is basically what, like when you're doing experiments in the lab, your behavior is the only real thing that you can measure as an intact kind of organism. Everything else you have to go to the cellular level or the molecular level. So and most of the behaviors are driven by basically the motor system or your muscles. Everything you do with your hand or mouth, or while you eat, while you drive, while you bike, everything is driven by the muscle system, the musculatures in your body. And the muscles are controlled by, directly innervated by motor neurons that are coming from the spinal cord of the central nervous system. And so the muscles are actually, if it's all over your body, they kind of constitute the most amount of tissue in your body. But if you think about it, if you look at it, there are individual muscle fibers like this. Each muscle fibers has, each muscle fiber bundles like this, and each bundle has many fibers. And one neuron will come and innervate all the muscles together. So one neuron can drive one fiber bundle, basically. And what happens is there are hundreds and thousands of bundles like that in one kind of muscle, what you call a definite muscle, and each definite muscle is controlling through ligaments connected to bones, and by contraction and relaxation, they're actually making a very specific movement. And so if you can, if you think about it, so it's not that there's one motor neuron firing to control one muscles. There are many motor neurons need to fire to actually the hand to move, even to make a very simple movement. While one contracts and the hand goes up, the other one relaxes and needs to relax so the bone actually the hand actually can move up. And this is the muscles are controlling by being attached to the bones, and they're also controlling how the movements by using the bones. They are the controlling structure of the bones, and bones are not directly innervated by the motor neurons, but the muscles are. And this is how the movement happens. So say this is your hand and it needs to go up. So what needs to happen? So there are flexors and extensors. So the flexors are inside. So they are contracting, and so if this has to go up and this has to relax for the hand to go up like this, and while coming down, this has to relax and this has to extend, contract for the hand to go down. So even though simple movement, there is so much possibilities and so much computation going on at the level of muscles and nerves. Yes, and then so there are the muscles that, as I said, that innervated by motor neurons. So they're called lower motor neurons. Why they're lower? Because there are motor neurons in your brain, in your brainstem and in your cortex. So they are connected to these motor neurons, and then they are controlling activity. So those are called like the upper motor neurons, and the lower motor neurons are in the spinal cord. So as when you talked about sensory neurons, the sensory neurons basically come here, and so there's the dorsal horn where the sensory information is coming in. And then you have the motor output. So these are the motor neurons, lower motor neurons, where each neuron is going and innervating one fiber, one bundle. But each fiber has only one innervation. And this innervation, if you remember the synapses, they're called the neuromuscular junction. This is the interface between the neurons, motor neurons, and the muscles. So one unit is basically innervating a number of muscles in the specific area so that it can each unit can drive activity, a certain pattern of activity, controlling movement. And when the motor neurons go out, this is called the ventral root, and the mixed spinal nerve, because when a nerve, you look at a nerve, these are not just motor neurons, they're sensory neurons too. So a nerve will have sensory neurons, which is going up, information taking into the central nervous system, and motor neurons, which are taking out or bringing out information from the central nervous system, processed information from the central nervous system. And so since this is called dorsal horn, this is called the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And then I have something called central canal, which is a ventricle full of cerebrospinal fluid. And just like sensory system, what you spoke about in the last class, the motor system is also segmented. So you have a cervical segments, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. So the motor neurons here kind of innervating a groin and leg area. Groin area, you have lumbar, which is innervating your the legs, and then thoracic, which is going to mostly chest. Cervical goes to mostly hand. And then you have also motor neurons here, which are innervating in the brainstem, which are innervating your face and tongue and the jaws and the eyes. So this is again just like sensory system. The segmentation is very critical. So each segment will innervate its kind of corresponding. So if there's a segment here, it will just innervate its corresponding area. It will innervate the sensory neurons will be here, motor neurons will be here, sensory neurons will be sending information this way, motor neurons are sending output, and then you can control. So depending on the sensation, your activity is controlled. Yeah, and then how are the muscle neurons are kind of what is this at the electrophysiological level? What is happening that can sustain your movement? So before that, so one motor neuron, as I said, is innervating a fiber. These are called alpha motor neurons. And if you record from the neurons and you kind of excite or twitch the muscles, what really happens is depending on basically the frequency. So if you are twitching, the muscles are twitching kind of far away from each other, in a temporary far the twitching is far from each other. It's kind of set apart in time. then it doesn't really do anything, or there's no contraction. But if it's fast enough, if the frequency is higher, you will see the motor neuron, it's kind of the activity. When you're recording from it, it looks like this. Eventually what happens is it's high enough, it looks like that, but if it kind of gets a threshold, then you can see a movement. So the point being is that the twitching has to be fast enough at kind of enough sufficient frequency to gain this plateau stage and eventually make a movement. Yeah, and then the muscles. So the muscles here can be of there are two major types. The first, fast muscle fibers and the slow muscle fibers. So fast muscle fibers are basically the muscle fibers that are, so say, like, you, as the example I give often, that you're going to step on a pin and eventually immediately you withdraw your leg. What really happens, the muscles that are involved there are the fast muscle fibers. The fast muscle fibers are basically can get easily fatigued. But what happens, why you need it for is, you need to say you are running and you need to make a sprint. To gain the speed, you are using your fast muscle fibers. But just to kind of maintain your speed, you need your slow muscle fiber, which doesn't get fatigued easily. So when you're doing an activity, depending on what kind of activity it is, your nervous system computes and kind of engages the muscle, the sort of muscle fibers that you need to carry out that activity. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. Yeah, so, and this is a kind of very interesting experiment done by a scientist called Tori Lomo, which I actually studied during my PhD. So what he did was, so each motor neuron is kind of connected to slow muscles and fast muscles. What it did was, so how does it control, like what controls identity, who decides that it becomes a slow muscle or fast muscle? So there can be two hypotheses, right? One hypothesis, this is basically made this way, and when during birth, it depends on the muscle, so it becomes a slow muscle fiber, so the slow motor neuron will innervate it, and fast muscle fiber, slow fast muscle fiber can innervate it. But the other hypothesis can be more interesting, is that the nervous system is actually where it's innervating is determining the properties of the muscles and deciding, okay, you become a slow or you become a fast. So it's a muscle is driving this identity, or the motor neurons are driving this identity. That's the question. So what he did was, he did a cross innervation experiment where he connected the fast to slow and slow to fast, and saw that if you do that, the fast becomes slow and slow becomes fast. So that's very interesting, because that means that neurons are driving it, and how you are training the muscles, you can actually change the identity. So that means that there is plasticity at this level, and neurons are driving this kind of your nervous system driving is how you train the muscle. So you can actually train your muscles, and that's how things happen. And you can kind of think about in athletes, so they can train themselves in very specific way to kind of gain very specific skills, which they are not naturally kind of inclined to do, or we cannot naturally do, but athletes actually can train themselves do certain activity this way. Or this experiment might explain that. And how the sensory innervation, so how do you know that, when you are kind of moving your arm, and then how does your brain kind of understand that where your hand is, so that what you need to do to move from kind of spot A to from the spot A to spot B. And how does it happen is, how it happens is that the muscle fibers are innervated by sensory neuron called proprioceptor in the spindle fiber. So if you remember the sensory neurons, so they're innervating everything, and then their neurons is called proprioceptors. These neurons are innervating in this structure called muscle spindles inside the muscle, which are basically sensing your position of your muscles or position of your limbs in space in 3 dimensions. So once it knows, it is all that, like, in real time, it's sending information to your brain. Okay, my arm is here, my muscles are here, and then your brain tells the spinal cord, okay, now you move the muscle there, depending on where you want to move it. And if you think about it, kind of thinking, okay, my hand is here, I want to move my hand from A to B. And and at that moment, like this fraction of a second, the information kind of brain is always real time, kind of perceiving where all your body parts are, and it has to choose between all the body parts, only one fraction, like one fraction of your body part, and has to move exactly from A to B. And that happens. All of that happens, in a fraction of a second. So you can understand how powerful this is. And again, there are hundreds of fibers here, hundreds of muscle spindles, thousands of proprioceptors, another thousands of motor neurons. And so the activity has to go up all through the cortex and come down and ask the motor neuron to do what it needs to do to make that specific movement. And there is also a reflex. So this is a patellar lip reflex that you can, it's done in a clinic. So what you do is when they just to check how is your reflex, how your nerves are working, you basically use a kind of a hammer-like thing, and you tap here, and your leg immediately goes up. So for this spinal reflex, knee-jerk reflex, you don't need your brain for that. So the spinal cord is sufficient. So the motor neuron will go here. We have spoken about this before. So motor neuron will take the information to the spinal cord, and then it will excite the alpha motor neuron, and that will raise the leg. So it's a very kind of very simple circuitry. But if we try to understand even the simple circuitry, we actually don't. Even now, we completely. I mean, this is known for hundreds of years, but even now we don't completely understand how this circuit, or even this circuit works out, or this how is it exactly happening to the every single and cell and molecular level. And so you can imagine how much we don't know or know about the internal nervous system. And then, of course, the brain also controls the movement, and there are there are various tracts that are coming down from the brain to the spinal cord, and you don't need to know all the names of the tracts, but just kind of know that there are heavy innervation of the spinal cord by the brain, and there are tracheocorticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, and the names are basically where they are coming originating from. So there's a cortex sends neurons down to spinal cord, corticospinal, red nucleus of rubrospinal, there's medullary reticulospinal. So there are many tracts like this, and they're innervating the motor neurons, they're innervating the neurons here called interneurons, and that's how they are kind of making complicated movements, informing the spinal cord about what's going on in the brain, and that's how everything is regulated. So the spinal cord becomes the final initial input of information, final output. So that's how it's. So that's why when you get a spinal cord injury, it affects kind of really badly a number of, not just your behavior or movement, but a number of physiological important functions, physiologically important functions. And then, so the brain, as I said, the brain control of movement. So it's the motor cortex basically is sending here to the where the motor neurons are. Then there's a red nucleus, rubrospinal, which is crossing over. So it'll be kind of you guys can read a little bit about, just know about what corticospinal tracts are, what the major tracts, and what does corticospinal tract do, corticospinal neurons do, and it's quite. So the paper I'm going to share with you is basically deals with that. It's like a very recent paper that figures out how the corticospinal neurons are eventually controlling movement. What is the kind of what to say how does the computation happens, like from directly in these neurons and controlling this. And the primary motor cortex, so basically, like you have a somatotropic map, which basically basically means that different parts of the motor cortex are kind of linked to different parts of your body. And if you can see that the hand compared to your leg, the hand and how dexterous, depending on how if you think about it, how dexterous we can do so many things with our hands. So hands needs a more dedicated neurons or kind of brain tissue or computing power to execute what we can do. And so accordingly, like hand actually kind of covers a lot of space in the motor cortex. And then there is this incredible structure called cerebellum, which is sitting. So before we go, so tomorrow we'll talk about when we start the class, we'll talk about a little more about cerebellum. So cerebellum sits in the hindbrain. It's if you see here, and then it's a evolutionary concept structure. What it does is it kind of works in parallel to motor cortex, and what it does is it helps in. A good example would be, say you learn how to ride bicycle, right? And then what happens is once you learn it, you never forget it. And nobody has to, like, say you didn't bike for 5 or 10 years, and then you got on a bicycle, you immediately know how to ride it, and you don't have to relearn it. And that's what cerebellum plays a very important role in that, where it's kind of internalizes that learning and stores it so that you don't have to consciously kind of wake it up. And that's why the cerebellum in collaboration with motor cortex helps you kind of internalize this kind of long-term learning. And it does it through this kind of beautiful structures where there are neurons called molecular, so the neuron called Purkinje cells and granule cells. And these are basically the folding, and as I said, these are evolutionary concept structures. So many mammals, even fish has some kind of protocerebellum. And so what I mean by that is that, this is some kind of a protobrain. They don't have much of cerebral cortex, but they have a very developed cerebellum. And just understanding how cerebellum is doing motor planning and kind of motor learning, we can understand how the brain can control and help us learn and also execute movements and execute refined movements. So so that's that. And then so the next will be more next class will be more of learning and emotion and cognition, and then we will kind of end the neuroscience classes for the UB20 and then the tests. Okay. So any questions?
Sir?
Yeah.
I think in one of your earlier slides, you had shown us that like there are multiple axon knobs, like in the neurotransmitter junction, just for like one of the generating one of the action potentials, right?
Sorry, can you repeat the question for me?
So there are like I think slide number 2 or 3.
Okay.
The first few slides. Yeah, where you had shown us like the yeah, exactly the next one.
Yeah.
No, I think it's slide 4, sir. Slide 4. Yeah. So here there are multiple axon knobs, right? Attached to that muscle fiber. Like, why don't we have one axon knob instead?
Right. So it's basically branches at the end. So if you have one, so there can be 2 reasons. One is like if you just have one and you lose that, you basically lose the muscle fiber, innervation of the muscle fiber. So it can compensate. Another thing is like one is too small to probably excite, one whole muscle fiber. And then you need it's not multiple copies, just one. One muscle fiber it's innervated by one fiber, but there are multiple synapses on it.
Oh, okay.
So you need a sufficient kind of release of sufficient amount of release of synaptic vessels to excite this entire fiber, right?
Yeah, but I was just wondering, like, even a single axon knob could do it, right? Like,
it may not be sufficient to have the enough amount of synaptic vesicles. So if the asked question is why they didn't make one giant synaptic vesicle, so it can boil down to like how efficient it is. And as I said, like it's probably not a very smart design, because if you lose one fiber here, what can happen is like, they lose one and they regenerate. It's more of a plastic system and they can compensate each other, right? Because as I said, the synapses stay forever for your life.
Yeah. And so I think one of your slides you had shown us like the ventral horn for different parts of the vertebrae, right?
Right.
So that I had a doubt. Like I saw the sizes were varying in like the lumbar region and
Yeah.
thorax. So what exactly is the reason for it?
So the reason, this is, we are all speculating, right? But the reason is basically the amount of area it has to cover, and then the kind of complicated muscles it has to innervate. So say like, the sacral is basically going to a groin area versus the lumbar is going to an entire leg. So it has more area to cover, more musculature to kind of more capabilities. It needs more, kind of, uh, like more, basically the more musculature to cover and more tissue to innervate. I think that's directly proportional to the amount of neurons that are required to innervate that area.
Oh, okay, and the last question is like the reflex action, the knee jerk which you had shown, that was associated with the spinal cord, right? If
Yeah.
let's say there's some damage, then can we, expect that the functioning can, rewire in such a way that it can, go to the brain?
Sorry, can you repeat that first part of the question? What you said?
So basically, the reflex is associated, knee jerk is associated with the spinal cord, and let's say the spinal cord gets damaged. So
Yeah.
now, can we expect that there is some rewiring that can,
Yeah, of course,
artificially.
of course. Yeah, of course. So if the injury is not like, harsh enough, it can regenerate to a certain extent.
Oh, okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Welcome. Yeah, anybody else? All right, then we'll just end this class.